So welcome today to this seminar of the Environmental Politics Standing Group of the ECPR. And Daniel cannot make it today, but I'm kind of replacing him as a chair of today's seminar. I'm Carolyn. I'm also a steering group, as member of the steering group of the standing group. And I'm happy to see that there are quite a few people today to hear more about the study or the presentation examining perceptions of socially just agricultural sustainability transitions to support the governance of such processes. Correct me if I pronounce it wrong, but Auvikki, you're presenting today. You are co-authoring the paper with Camilla. And yeah, I guess we can start with your presentation, and once you're done, we can just go over to answer certain questions and reflections on your presentation.
Sounds good. Let me first see if I can figure out how to get my screen sharing.
Mm-hmm.
It should by now have some...
Yes.
Yes, works. Perfect. All right. So yeah, thank you for that introduction. And I'm really happy to be here to be able to share my work with you. And I'm especially looking forward to hear what your thoughts on this topic are in the discussion at the end. And yeah, as Caroline said, I am a PhD student at the University of Reading. And as of this week, I am in the third and final year of my PhD. And my background is in political science, but with my PhD, I am taking a bit more of an interdisciplinary approach. And the overarching PhD looks at the governance of agricultural transitions and more specifically at how we can shape governance in a way that supports the perceived legitimacy and the perceived justice. And with that, the social sustainability of such transitions. Now, and the work that I will talk about today will form the third paper of my PhD. And the title has changed a little bit, but as you can see here on the slide, I'm still focusing on justice perceptions to support the governance of agricultural sustainability transitions. And while I am presenting alone today, I want to emphasize that this work is being done in collaboration with my co-author, Dr. Sabrina Dressel, and also with the support of my two supervisors, Dr. David Rose and Professor Camilla Sandström. Yeah, and in this talk, I will first say a few words about why there is a need for an agricultural transition. And after that, I will elaborate in more detail on why it is important that these kind of transitions are governed in a just way. But I will also problematize this idea of a just agricultural transition and propose a solution to this that could help support governance efforts. And in the end, I will conclude with a brief outline of the steps that still lie ahead for this project. So why do we need agricultural transitions? Well, on the one hand, we see that currently dominant agricultural practices contribute considerably to biodiversity loss, environmental degradation, and climate change. And it does have to be said that these practices are in part a result of the agricultural support policies that incentivize particular ways of farming. But for example, Auvikki et al., and I have no idea if I pronounced that correctly, but I hope so, in their recent systematic review on the environmental impact of food and agricultural production, they state, for example, that a fourth of the global greenhouse gas emissions stem from food production, and 82% of this then comes from crop production, livestock and fisheries, and land use changes for agricultural purposes. But of course, other negative impacts on the environment from agriculture stem, for example, from monoculture farming and the heavy use of pesticides and fertilizers that have a negative impact on biodiversity. On the other hand, agriculture is also under increasing pressure itself and negatively impacted by these environmental changes, as well as by demographic change. So, for example, extreme and more unpredictable weather makes it increasingly difficult to grow food, But at the same time, we are also demanding, or the demands that society puts on food in terms of its quality and quantity, the way we grow it or produce it, and the types of food that we want is changing due to these demographic changes and changes in our lifestyles. So because of this, it is widely recognized that there is a need for sustainability transition in the agricultural sector, as well as a change in the policies that shape agricultural practices. But while it is quite easy to become really enthusiastic about the idea of a transition and how this might address and solve all the challenges that we're dealing with, it is really important not to forget that transitions are not neutral, straightforward processes that everyone and everything will benefit from. So quite to the contrary, actually, it is in the nature of a transition to be disruptive, because in order to reach a new sustainable agricultural system, the old system will have to be destructed or at least altered considerably. And this is in a way like in nature, where in order for a caterpillar to become a butterfly, the caterpillar will have to cease to exist. And with the agricultural transitions, the consequence of this disruption will be very different from one person to the other. In addition, transitions are also normative. So unlike a caterpillar who has no choice but to become a specific kind of butterfly that it is destined to be, when we are looking at agricultural transitions, we actually have a choice. So we can decide what kind of state we want to transition to, what kind of end state do we want to reach, as well as the path that we want to take to reach that state. And what I perceive as a sustainable agricultural system might look very differently from what you or someone else who is not here today would think. And because of this disruptive and normative characteristic of transitions, they are also inherently political. And they are political because, in a way, the transition process forms a sort of arena where all kinds of different interests compete over the influence on both the direction as well as the manner in which the agricultural sector is developed, and how the costs and benefits resulting from this transition are then going to be distributed. Now, this nature of transitions in general has already been recognized and picked up by labor organizations in the 1970s, as they started to campaign for sustainability transitions to be conducted in a socially just way. And this idea of a just transition has to date also been incorporated in multiple international agreements and declarations. So here are 3 examples. The first one is from the Paris Agreement. The second one is from the Solidarity and Just Transition Silesia Declaration. And the third one is from the European Green Deal. And as you can see highlighted here in yellow, all of them talk about a just transition. But besides that, they state that this includes a just transition of the workforce with the creation of decent work and quality jobs. None of these documents provide a clear definition of what they exactly mean with a just transition, nor do they give a blueprint of how this should then be achieved. Now, if we turn to the academic literature, the concept of a just transition has primarily been connected to climate change and energy transitions. And only rather recently has this been broadened to other areas, including agricultural transitions. So I have listed here a couple of articles that pick up on this, but the 2 examples that I wanted to highlight is the one here on the left by Charlotte Blättner, who highlights the need for a just transition in animal agriculture, and the article here on the right by Hepnick et al. And they propose that social justice, equity, and inclusion are going to be an important avenue for agriculture food transition research in the coming decade. but because the application of the concept of a just transition in relation to agriculture is still rather recent, also here there is no clear understanding in the literature as to what exactly a just agricultural transition looks like, and how this should be achieved. And in a way, this is not really surprising that there is no clear definition and blueprint on what a just transition in general and a just agricultural transition in specific is, because there exists no universally agreed meaning of justice. So the blind justitia as a symbol of true justice is kind of misleading, because the rules by which she decides right from wrong, or in other words, how we form our perceptions on what is just or isn't just, are entrenched in individual values and societal norms. And also views on how justice should be prioritized and enacted through policies will vary. So justice, like transitions, is a very normative concept. But if we don't want to let go of the idea that agricultural transitions should be conducted in a just manner, this leaves us with a problem. Because if we have no clear idea of what is meant by a just transition, it will be really difficult to actually achieve this. But if we can then agree that we need clarification on what a just transition means, this leaves us to a next question, namely of whose and what notion of justice should we then follow, and by what means? Or alternatively, how can we design transition policies in a way that can incorporate different and potentially conflicting perceptions of justice? And my argument here today is that if we want to create transitions that are not only just, but also socially sustainable, then it is of central importance that we or that the notions of justice that we use to design or to govern an agricultural transition will reflect the justice perceptions of society. But to the best of my knowledge, there currently does not exist an instrument that can support the governance of agricultural transitions by assessing society's justice perceptions in relation to agricultural transitions. So in this piece of work, we set out to develop such an instrument in the form of a survey. And yeah, so to develop this instrument, we focused on the underlying structures and dimensions of justice perceptions that are generally used to make these normative claims of justice, rather than that we add yet another normative interpretation of what justice or a just transition is. And we draw on insights from political philosophy, social psychology, as well as environmental justice, food justice, and social justice literature. And within these strands of literature, we identified 3 overarching dimensions that are generally brought forward, namely procedural, distributional, and recognitional justice. And I will go through each of these in turn. Yeah, so if we first come to the dimension of distributional justice. In this dimension, we find the structures that people use to decide how costs and benefits of the transition should be distributed in society. So in a way, who should be buying the ingredients to bake the cake, who should be baking the cake, and who gets to eat which slice of the cake, if any at all. And we found 3 main elements that are central to this. So first of all, what mechanisms or policy instruments to distribute the cost and benefits are perceived as being just? So do people prefer financial incentives and financial disincentives, or do they prefer regulations or guidance and information? And to assess this, we developed a long list of potential policy instruments based on current and proposed policy documents, as well as 2 workshops, one with agricultural researchers and one with environmental governance researchers. And in the survey, we asked the respondents to indicate for each of these instruments and how far they think that they are just or not. The second part of distributional justice is constituted of perceptions on whether or not the right kind of costs and benefits are being considered. Or if we come back to this cake metaphor, are we actually baking and handing out the right kind of cake or not? And in the survey, we assessed this by asking the respondents to rank order a list of potential topics that we identified in the agricultural transition, food justice and environmental justice literature. And we asked the participants to rank these from most to least important. And the idea is that they say, so this topic needs to be considered in the transition in order for the transition to be just. Third and finally, in this dimension, we are also concerned here with whether the underlying principles by which the costs and benefits are distributed is regarded as just. And the principles that are generally used to build arguments around in the literature are equality, equity and need, merit and entitlement. So for example, do people perceive it as just when the costs and benefits of the transition are distributed in such a way that everyone contributes and benefits exactly equally? Or do they perceive it as more just if the costs and benefits are distributed based on people's resources and needs? And so in the survey for each of these principles, we have developed 3 items, and we asked the respondents to answer or to indicate for each of them whether or not they agree that this specific way of distributing costs and benefits of agricultural transitions is just. When we come to the second dimension, the procedural justice dimension, then let's see, this dimension, is made up of, on the one hand, the perceptions on the degree of stakeholder involvement and the principles of stakeholder involvement on the other hand. So the degree of stakeholder involvement relates to how much or how little influence stakeholders should receive in the transition process for the process to be regarded as just. And in the survey, we assess perceptions on this by asking respondents to indicate the extent to which they agree or disagree with certain degrees of stakeholder involvement. And the items that we made for this were based on the letter of citizen participation by Einstein. The other bit here, so the principles of procedural justice are basically the same as the principles of distributional justice. So again, equality, equity and need, merit and entitlement. But we now apply them to what kind of stakeholders should get more or less influence in the transition process. So for example, if someone uses merit as their principle of procedural justice, they would find it just if experts on agriculture have most influence in the decision-making in the governance process. The third and final dimension of justice perceptions is the perception of recognitional justice. And this dimension firstly constitutes of perceptions of who should be a subject of justice. So specifically, which stakeholders should be considered when we distribute costs and benefits, and which stakeholders should be considered to be included in the transition process. So should this be specific currently living people, or may this also be future generations or animals, or even nature more broadly? And this also encompasses the question of there are specific societally vulnerable groups that require explicit recognition for an agricultural transition to be just. And to assess perceptions on this, we made, again, a really long list with potential stakeholders. And we included also the option for respondents to add additional ones if they felt like we missed some. And for each of these, we asked the respondents to indicate how high priority the interests of these specific stakeholders should receive in order for the transition to be just. Secondly, the second bit of the recognitional justice perceptions is the types of knowledge that are being considered. So this relates to whether for a decision to be regarded as just, this decision should be based on scientific knowledge, or maybe also, or even exclusively on, for example, experimental or local knowledge. And we asked this in the survey quite directly. So what kind of knowledge should decisions be based on in order for the decision to be regarded as just? The third part of recognitional justice then focuses on geographical scale. So what is the geographical scale that we should consider or that should be taken into account? So for example, should we only think about local stakeholders and local consequences for the transition to be considered just? Or should we also think about regional or even global stakeholders and consequences? And finally, this dimension also includes the viewpoint that people use to form their perceptions of justice. So more specifically, whether people are primarily concerned with how the transition affects them personally compared to how their own life was before the transition, or do they base their perception of justice on how the transition affects themselves in comparison to how it affects others? And we assessed this in the survey again with 3 items for each of these constructs, and we asked the respondents to indicate how important or unimportant they find these points. Now, based on these dimensions and all their subsections, we propose this model as a depiction of the underlying structure of people's perceptions of what a just agricultural transition should look like. So in the center here, we have the overall perception of whether or not a specific agricultural transition is just. In the inner circle around that, we have the 3 dimensions of justice, which, as you can see, they also influence each other, as well as the overall justice perception. And then on the outer bit, we have the various subdimensions and their individual categories. Now, the idea with this is that if we know how this structure looks in a specific society, we can then build the governance of the agricultural transition around that. So in a very, very simplified example, if we only look in the right bottom corner here on the distributional justice, if we do this survey in a given society X, and this survey shows that this society X dominantly uses equality as its principle of distributional justice, that it sees regulations as the most just mechanism to distribute costs and benefits. And if they highlight that access to affordable food and high nutritional quality food are most important to them, then we know that if we want to increase the chance that people will perceive the agricultural transition to be just, we should focus on these aspects in the governance of the transition. Now, I had planned to present you the tested version of this model and the results of our survey. But as I've come to know how it happens in research, rarely anything ever goes according to plan. So we had multiple unforeseen issues with the company that is collecting the data for us. So that has delayed our data collection with more than a month. Which basically means that I now have to leave you with a cliffhanger as to whether this theory-based model also holds up with empirical data or not. So therefore, the next steps in this project will be, of course, first to finalize data collection as soon as possible, and then to test this model. And we're planning to do that based on a structural equation modeling analysis. And then I will write up the results in an article. But for now, I am really curious, as said, to hear from you whether you agree with our theoretical model and structural dimensions and subdimensions that we have identified, or whether you think that maybe we have missed something or included something that we should not have included, for example. But most importantly, I want to thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, or anything, please let me know either now, or you can also email me at any later point. And my email address is down here on the slide. And just very quickly, these are the references that I built this talk around. So yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you.
I'm just going to stop sharing so I can actually see you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for the presentation of the theoretical model. Maybe before we go ahead to the questions of the audience, I was wondering, can you tell a bit more about the data collection? Like, where do you collect it, and what kind of data is there going to be that you can analyze?
Yeah, of course. So we are testing this model in the English context, because my PhD overall looks at England. So the whole, that's maybe something I should have mentioned before, actually. The whole survey is now designed within the English context, but it can be adapted to be used in other contexts as well. And our plan is we are trying to get at least 400 responses from the English general population. And we are doing this through a third party who is collecting the data for us, because we wanted to make sure that the responses that we have reflect the percentages in the population in terms of education level, income, the region where they live, and things like that, so that it's a representative sample, which we couldn't do when we would collect the data ourselves, because there's not like a clear register with addresses and this kind of information that we could use to send out the survey otherwise.
Mm-hmm. So you're using a survey institute or exactly. A professional one. Okay, thanks.
And if any one of you has experience with doing something like that, I would be very curious to hear what your experiences are, and if you had any challenges and how you overcame them, because as I said, it's been quite a process.
I can just say that I have had good experiences with it, but it's always also good to know what to, like, setting up certain rules of if there is too many from one social group that and you have to keep them out, like to find the right balance between those that you how long do you recruit to fill the gaps that are missing of the difficult to reach ones. Yeah, because it can then become a bit deliberate, yeah, and trying to sample too stubbornly, or yeah, trying to reach the difficult ones. But yeah, clear rules and good communication with the company should lead to good results.
Thank you.
Well, so I think we can just open the floor for questions and reflections, and maybe also answers to your questions. Yeah, Johanna, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. Very inspiring talk, and also the theoretical framework that you presented really in breadth is impressive. Actually, what you've what you've collected in the literature. Regarding the question whether I think that there's something missing, I think, as I said, that you already gathered a lot of explanatory factors that are really relevant, so I probably would not leave something out. What I was wondering is whether you account for kind of personal backgrounds of the people. I don't know whether this is already included and kind of included in one of the factors that you listed, but I could imagine that depending on the socialization, for example, of the individuals and due to their maybe personal beliefs or attitudes, that it makes a difference whether they perceive something as just or not. So that's kind of a question / suggestion if you have included that. And then a comment on working together with companies in gathering research data. I found I only have one experience which I found worked quite well, but we had the challenge that they sometimes wanted to change certain questions, which then would not fit to the theoretical background anymore. I don't know whether you can relate to that, but
yes.
Yeah, I found that quite hard actually to convince them that it has to be that a question has to be formulated that way exactly, because that's actually, has been proven reliable and valid. So yeah, I have had the same experience that it's sometimes hard to find a compromise there, which also fits to what they are usually doing.
Yeah, thank you very much for both the comment, the suggestion, and the question. I think in terms of your question on the personal background, yes, we are also collecting background information. So we collect information on, well, I said the education, their income, their age, but also their religion, their political beliefs as well. I think these were it. I might be forgetting one right now, but so we have not yet incorporated those into the model, but I think that would be another step to look at that as well. So how do then these background factors influence what we see in the model, which could maybe be done with like a cluster analysis where we can then see, okay, if there are specific types of people that come up with all have the same kind of justice perceptions, then maybe we know that we should target this group of people in a certain way when we communicate about a transition. Yeah, thank you.
Further questions, comments? Yes.
Yeah, maybe also something that just came to my mind. Probably you have quite a large questionnaire then, and I was wondering how you ensure that the people actually answer it, and how long you plan the questionnaire to take time for people to answer, because that's also something that I find always challenging to cut questionnaires down to the necessary questions.
Yes, that was the struggle of the last half year to try to shorten this survey. So there were originally also some other concepts that we ended up taking out because they had too much overlap with the other ones. We also initially had for each of these sub constructs 4 different items, which resulted in a survey that would take about an hour to fill in. So we did pilot that, and then we went through and took out. So for each of the constructs, we ended up with only 3 items, for example, and I said the ones that were overlapping, we kind of try to merge them. So in the end, we ended up with a survey that takes about 15 minutes to fill in. But in the data that we do have so far, we see extreme differences between some people that only take 10 minutes and other people that take half an hour. So I guess it depends on how much time people take to really reflect on what it is that they are answering. How we are ensuring that people are answering, it's maybe advantage or disadvantage of using this company. The one hand was that we, because it's an online survey, we have forced responses for everything, which means that if people don't answer things, then they can't continue. And through the company, they only get paid once they have completed the whole survey. which kind of gives another incentive to ensure that people actually fill in the survey. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Conrad, please go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much for this great talk. It was really inspiring, and I enjoyed also how you put it all together with all the theoretical literature that you used. So I must have to research on just transitions in the energy field, focusing on coal transitions mainly, and usually follow more of a qualitative approach. So I have one question and one remark. My question would be, whether you said that you are planning to test this model now empirically, and so that you have these 400 respondents, and I wonder, do you have any thesis that you follow at this moment already, or any suspicions on what the result could look like? I mean, for us, of course, it's interesting to hear whether you have some any ideas on what the outcomes could look like. So that would be my question, and my remark would be that on this this model that you presented, I've seen that you also looked at the aspect of scale, and I think it was mainly in connection with the category of recognition-based justice. And so there were basically two remarks that I was having. One was whether the question of scale could be relevant also with regard to aspects of distributional and procedural justice. Thinking, for instance, on the distributional dimension, on questions of who should get what kind of compensation and so on in a scalar perspective, let's say from the EU level or on a national or subnational level and so on. So that would be one remark, whether scale could come also into play for the other categories. And another aspect that I was thinking about is whether the question of time could actually be another one, the temporal dimension of transitions. For instance, if we look at questions of what do people consider just with regards to the ambition of a transition, how fast should it go? Like if we follow transition, then for instance, from a climate justice perspective, maybe you end up with a more ambitious transition and you have a shorter timelines as to for those that, for instance, seek to have it in a more manageable way, and then maybe would prefer to have longer transition periods. And so this question of time was another one that was coming to mind. So yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, both for the question and the comments. I did make some notes, so I hope that I will be able to react to all of it, but let me know if I forgot something. So first, in regards to the question of the outcomes. So I said the data that I have so far, I'm now just started to look through it, and it looks like at least the items that we used do hang together quite well, but I haven't done any statistical tests on this yet, so I want to be very careful with making any statements on that yet. Similarly with the model, so in the we did do a pilot study for before we went on with this full-scale survey, and with that it did look like at least the instruments that we are using to measure all these different concepts are working, but this was a quite small pilot study, so there are two I want to be careful with being too confident in saying that yes, this works. In terms of the different scales, so the first point that you made on the whether the geographical scale is also important for the distribution and the process, yes, of course. But what I try to do in this model is to separate out things as much as possible, so there were no overlaps. But my idea is that, or because these different dimensions all relate to each other and influence each other, so my thought would be that if we include the geographical scale in the recognitional dimension, that automatically will influence what we then see in the distributional dimension and the procedural dimension. So if we say in the recognitional dimension, okay, we think that the local scale is especially important, then we should see that reflected, that if we talk about the distribution of cost and benefits, that we think it's important that we look at how these are distributed on the local scale rather than on the global scale. I hope that that is a clear explanation. I'm not sure. In relation to the time scale, yes, good point. I haven't really thought about that yet. But I agree with you that that would be an important thing as well. So it would be interesting to look into that more as well. Yeah, thank you. I hope I didn't forget anything.
No, not at all. No, you covered everything. I have actually one question back, if that's okay, but
Sure.
we can also let the others go first. Okay. Now you said that from these pre-tests or pre-surveys that you did, that these models were working more or less. I still wonder, like, what do you mean by that? I mean, is it that then enough to say like we covered the main categories, or do you have already any kinds of results on like what people actually do consider just? I mean, that would be the things that are, of course, for us maybe also interesting to hear, like any directions. If there should be any results already on that point, then I would be interested to hear about that.
Yeah. No, I wish. I really wish.
It's not
I'm
that far
very
yet.
sorry.
Okay.
No. So my point was that I didn't want to start to analyze the data until I actually have the complete data, because if I start to draw out results now on a limited set of data, then I might just come up with something that's completely wrong. So I rather wait with saying anything about the actual results until I have all the data to back it up.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Maybe I can also mention a question myself, which I had now, which is somehow tied to the previous discussion. So I was wondering also, you are focusing on the agricultural transition. So would you also expect that the justice perception of people with respect to the agricultural transition is in some way outstanding, like different from transitions with respect to other kinds of transitions, which are not really related to agriculture, or in reverse, are you expecting that it's quite comparable and therefore also a good case study, which can let you draw also conclusions about the justice perceptions and their relationship to transition perceptions in other areas?
Both yes and no, I think. In the literature, it has been said quite clearly that perceptions of justice are context dependent. So what I might find just in relation to agriculture may be very different to what I find just in relation to energy transitions. However, this general underlying idea of that I use, for example, equality as a main principle of deciding whether or not something is just, that may be transferable. But I would be careful in making that kind of transition. What I do think what would be possible is if we see that we now have to develop the survey and it works in the agricultural sector, let's see how can we adapt this to also work in another setting. But that would require an adaptation of the items that we are using, because, for example, with the policy instruments that we list specific policy instruments in relation to agriculture. So if we want to apply this to another sector, then we would exchange those for whatever policy instruments are being used in that sector. And the same, of course, with the topics, for example, that we list as being important or not important. Those are also really case specific. The same with stakeholders that we want to include or not, which could have some overlap across sectors, but not necessarily.
Thanks. Great. Other questions? Yes, Madita.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Auvikki. You already talked about it, that you didn't look in the data now, and I think this is a really good process. But was there something in the pilot study you found really surprising? And could you include an open question, for example, which gives you some qualitative data as well? Was there something you found surprising, or even, yeah, just as you expected?
So first of all, yes, we have a qualitative question at the end, where we basically ask people to say whatever they want. So whether they want to say something about how they found the survey, if there was something that we didn't include, any comments. And in the pilot, there were not too many. There were mainly comments on it's difficult to answer these things, or it's a great survey. So they were contradicting each other, which was really funny. But not so, yeah, so not as specific. I did look through the comments that we're getting back on the survey now to see if there were any problems while it was going. And there, it's also very diverse what people are writing. So I think one of the comments that stuck to mind most actually was a comment that the survey has nothing to do with justice, but with morals and ethics, which I thought was a really interesting comment, because that shows so much how somebody can interpret justice so differently than somebody else, which is kind of the point of the whole survey. In terms of something interesting that came out of the pilots, there again, I want to be really careful, because we had, I think in total we had 81 people participating in the pilot, but only 42 complete answers. So we did do exploratory factor analysis to see if the items are working to measure the constructs, but we didn't actually test this whole model because it was not enough data for that. And with that, what I found, yeah, I think one of the things that were interesting, but that, as I said, we have to see how this will look in the actual data that we're collecting now, is that these, especially these principles of justice, that they were quite overlapping, so that people use not just one of these, but they may use multiple. And the other thing that was really clear in the pilot in relation to the topics that people find important. So in the pilot, we didn't ask them to rank order them, but we asked them to say, how important do you find this topic for justice? And they found everything important, which was really interesting. And then we decided for the final thing to make it rank order, so we can also see how important they find them if they have to trade off one for the other. But yeah, I found it fascinating that everyone found everything important.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I was just thinking about this in the beginning, time you start talking about the pilot, that you might see that standard deviation are so large that you, yeah, I don't know, can't even validate your scale or something. But yeah, this is really interesting. And what I think, I don't know if you came to the point as well, but every time I try to talk to like normal people about agriculture, they are just not concerned about the topic. Is it something you recognized as well in the pilot study?
So the pilot we did at the University of Reading. The University of Reading has a big agricultural community, so that's a little bit tricky. So that's also an additional thing why our pilot should be treated with caution. But what I find in the comments that we're now getting back in the actual survey is that people are commenting, oh, this is really interesting, I haven't thought about this before, or oh, I didn't realize that agriculture had so many impact on our daily lives. And it really made us start to think about this. So I do think you're absolutely right that people generally don't think about this. Unless they are really directly impacted by it. And I think that's especially with these transitions, that at the moment, people are not aware of how much they are dependent and related to the agricultural system that we have it as it is. But as soon as it starts to change, then people will notice the impacts. And if they don't like them, they will start to protest. So that's why I think that we do need to be concerned with what people think of these agriculture transitions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you a lot.
Thank you.
Very nice point. Yeah. Other questions? Konrad, you unmuted you. So
well, yeah, I mean, I don't have a question, but if I may maybe add something to the discussion here, then I was wondering, now that this topic was also brought up, that some people are just not really concerned about the agricultural transition. I think That is an interesting point because, of course, there are some people that are really affected by transitions, and those are usually the people that are then also tend to have some really strong claims on what they consider just and what they don't consider just, and potentially maybe also those are the groups that can also shape a transition to happen or not to happen. So I wonder whether that is maybe also an interesting question then for research, whether it would be, for instance, interesting to, I don't know, have a follow-up with in a more qualitative manner where you talk to either farmers or you talk to maybe environmentalists or so, because like what I know from our cases where we look at eco-transitions is that there are really certain groups of, for instance, affected workers that can really strongly like also block certain developments to happen because they have a they are very much concerned, very much affected, but at the same time also they have certain power. They are organized in certain groups, and basically then this is also the way that they influence transitions. And I mean that's something that we see with farming also a lot when we look, for instance, to the Netherlands, but also in other cases. And I don't know about the environment where you did this research, but yeah, just as an idea, I think this is an interesting point to follow up, like who's like which groups are really concerned by transitions, and what is also their leverage, or what is their power also.
Yeah, I really agree. Good point. Also, maybe one thing that's good to mention is that at the end of the survey, we do also have a question asking how far people find it important that these agricultural transitions are just or not. And there you see also not everyone thinks it's important, which is also good to know that some people just say, no, I really don't care about this. And yeah, I wonder though, because when we are talking about agriculture, it's really easy to forget on the one hand that we all depend on it to live, to survive. So if we do these transitions wrong and all the farmers go bankrupt, we do have a considerable problem. But at the same time, if we don't do these transitions, and the impact that agriculture now has on the environment also impacts everyone. And not everyone may be as aware that agriculture has such a big contribution to that. So I wonder if people are not interested in it now because they are not aware of it. And if they would start to notice the consequences more, as well as realize where the issues come from, that then they would start to be more vocal about it. But yeah, I really agree that it would be very nice to look into this qualitatively as well more.
Yeah.
Here you could probably also argue that currently the farmers are already getting going into bankruptcy even without the transition, and people don't really seem to care. So yeah, probably then also if the transition has some negative impacts on the farmers, it could not raise very much more interest among the people. On the other hand, it could also be more controversial because it's then also under the label of transition with respect to greening the economy and sustainability issues, and that can also sometimes, yeah, bring up certain tensions that were beforehand just more easier ignored or so. Or not. Yeah. Any other questions? No, I think everyone here is probably looking forward and also to the final study and the publication to find out how the empirical results can also fit in with the model. Do you have any time plans for that? Well, it's
well, I said
difficult to say. Yes.
Yeah, the time plan was to have this paper written by about now, or at least the end of this month. And as said, we're still collecting data, and I'm not sure how long this is going to take because deadlines keep being missed and missed and missed. So I hope as soon as I have the data, then maybe in 1 or 2 months, but I don't know.
Yeah. Good luck then with that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, so if there are no further questions or comments, reflections, discussion points, I guess we can also just leave it here and have a break for today. Maybe end our working day. Thank you also from our standing group to all of you for having joined the seminar. Thank you also for presenting today at the seminar.
Thank you for inviting
I hope
me.
you also had some nice input, some helpful ideas that you picked up. And yeah, I hope to see you again then to the next seminar, which is in around a month. I don't know it by heart myself, but you will definitely also receive several reminders of via the standing group email list.